I'm Kirsten Lehnert, one of the co-chairs of the COPDESS cluster, and would like to welcome you. We have two members of our steering group online, and I think we should just go around and briefly introduce ourselves to everybody else so we know who's in the room. As I said, I'm co-chair of COPDESS, but I run two different repositories for geochemistry and cosmochemistry and sample data. And that's been my interest. And I think we will come back a little bit into the origin of this. I see mostly new faces, I think. Has any one of you been to a COPDESS cluster meeting before? Great. So I should probably give a bit more later in. Do we have that microphone to go around so that... Okay, that's good. Leslie, and why don't you just briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Leslie Wyborn. I'm a co-chair of COPDESS. I've been involved in COPDESS since Kirsten first dragged me into it in, 2012 or something like that. I work on both at the Australian National University. I work on both really large volume geophysical data sets as well as small volume geochemical data sets. And I'm really interested in how the researchers get the connections from their papers to the source data in an effective way such that it counts on their CVs. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Leslie. My name is Matt Work. I am the senior publisher for Earth Science and Paleontology at the Taylor and Francis Group publisher. So in that role, I am responsible for around 16 geoscience titles, which range from large geochemistry and geology through to that are proprietary and owned by a publisher through to society journals. So I have this kind of large overview of all the different kinds of publishing workflows that we have, and that's what I've been bringing to this project that we'll be talking a little bit about today, the Repo2Pub project. I've been involved with COPDESS now for I think 4 years, something of that order, and yeah, looking forward to the session.
All right, before I start passing this around, can Leslie and Matt, can you guys hear me if I use this microphone?
Yeah.
Beautiful. So I'm going to pass it around in person.
Hello, I am Dean Carter. I am a data officer from NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, which is NOAA's official data repository.
Hi, I'm Paul Lemieux. I'm also with NOAA's NCEI. I'm a data archivist and data officer and metadata specialist. And I have no idea what COPDESS is, but I hope to learn more about it today.
Hi, I'm Brandy Downs. I'm at JPL. I'm on NISAR, and I'm also on PODAC. So I also am new to learning about what COPDESS is.
Hi, I'm Terry Bellicut. I'm from DOE Oak Ridge National Lab, and I'm a data curator manager on 3 long-term projects.
Hi, I'm Mac Borazon. I'm a PhD student in information science.
This is really cool that we do have lots of new faces. We've lost 2 people who are in parallel sessions, but that's okay. So I will start off in just giving you a very brief intro to COPDESS and where it came from and where we are now. Leslie will talk a little bit or give an introduction to this part 1 of analyzing the publisher repository researcher workflow. And Matthew will give a presentation in that. I have just a few aspects of, working with editors in a very domain-specific aspect. And then Danny Kincaid will talk about the GeoFair project. And I think then towards the end, we come to deciding, what we're going to do with this COPTESS statement. So as far... Oh, that's Leslie. I leave that up. So let me just introduce you a little bit to COPTESS. COPTESS stands for the Coalition for Publishing Data in the Earth and Space Sciences. And it was created in 2013. I have been running since 2007 this editors roundtable for geochemistry. And it was basically a forum where we met once a year to bring publishers and data repositories into one room and talk about how they can help each other, making sure that the data are reported in consistent manner and comprehensive manner. And this was, back in 2008 was a new word. There were no FAIR principles. So that's where it really came from. And I think it was an AGU meeting in 2012 where we continued this, and we had people from geophysics and from other domains in the room who said, why don't we do this on a more broad scale, not just focusing on geochemistry? And it followed with a meeting in 2013 at AGU headquarters, were basically the group that was there, which included funders as well, professional societies, all said this is a worthwhile thing that we should continue, but nobody wanted yet another organization. So it became this forum that has been meeting since then once or twice a year. In recent years, usually at the AGU fall meetings, we set up a gathering. And at the EGU General Assembly in April. So it's, both sides of the ocean to engage everybody, because we're obviously very international in, working with journals. We have Matthew on here and European journals, US journals, and so on. And what came out of the first meeting was a statement of commitment where basically the publisher is saying, this is what we're going to do to help data be more open, to help the data be of better quality, accessible, and so on. And I think it was about 2016 when AGU received funding for a project called Enabling FAIR. This was just at the beginning of FAIR principles becoming really relevant. And so in that project, it engaged in a much more sophisticated, much more professional way between the repositories and the publishers. And there was a new commitment statement, which was much more detailed. And I think one of the most important aspects of that commitment statement was that journals would no longer allow data in supplements, which is still happening, but there have been a lot of challenges, a lot of lessons learned. And I think that's why we have this part 2 in the meeting today to discuss, should we review this commitment statement, because the world has obviously changed since, when was that written, 2018 or so. Following this Enabling FAIR project, we talked about how do we keep COPTESS a bit more sustainable. It was dependent on just a couple of people running it. And so the decision was made to move it to ESIP and make it an ESIP cluster. This has had its own challenges in that, ESIP is not a meeting where publishers show up and pay the registration fee and so on. So we've had a bit, of discussions which we should continue. Is this really the best way to engage both publishers and repositories in this effort to align workflows to align policies in a more consistent way. Any questions to that? Okay, then I would say, Leslie, I hand to you now to introduce Matt, I think.
Okay, so I just first, before I go to Matt, I want to give an introduction to what we're trying to do in this session, and that's why the title is Ouch. What are the pain points? And as Kirsten said, it's 2018, 2019 when the AGU Enabling Fair Data in Publications project kicked off. And I think we can be pretty blunt. It's not exactly working. And so parallel to the ESIP cluster, there were a couple of projects that were being run. One is the repository to publish a work group, which I'll introduce. And another one is one on GeoFair. So in the repository Repo2Pub project, what we were looking at was publishers and repositories. There's another project called GeoFair where we're looking at the interplay with researchers. No, like, you go back.
Get back.
Go back, please. I don't want to go on.
No, sorry, the slides moved more. No, those don't seem to work. They.
There we go.
All I do is.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, we're right now. And so for the first part, what we want to do is present results. Oh, yeah, and then Kirsten, she said for years has been working on editors, and the three main groups we can report back today on are publishers, editors, and researchers. And we sort of another metaphor we're using that should be better is the leaky pipeline. And as you can see in this diagram I've grabbed off the web, we sort of got people who are involved, but we're not quite sure how to engage them, but more importantly, keep them in the workflow, and then hopefully start to identify who the key actors are. Because since COPDESS started, for example, with stealing Matt's thunder, one of the things that's become so blatantly clear is the role of the societies themselves, and those societies are actually creating an influence that I would argue we were not necessarily fully aware of. Okay, so as I said, we're looking at the pain points. Next slide, please. So this repo to publisher workflow is being done as part of this working group in RDA, and the chairs of that are Matt, myself, Danny Kincaid, and Natalie Raya. And I don't know why, but it's got this terribly long name, Coordinating Earth Space Environmental Science Data Preservation and the Scholarly Publication Process Working Group. So you can see why we call it Repo2Pub. Next slide, please. So in Repo2Pub, we were looking at this, workflow, and in part from the researcher perspective. And the problem we already know that, as Kirsten said, the publishers want us to share data under the publications, but typically a researcher waits till absolutely the last minute when they get their notification from the publisher that we're ready to go, give us the DOI for your data set by yesterday. And we know there's little awareness and communication across relevant stakeholders about needs and timelines. But above all, if you're using disciplinary repositories, which are the best, curation takes time and it takes money. Next slide.
Oh,
and
yes.
yeah, that's correct. So when we started this project, we knew that researchers We're just going to Zenodo, getting a DOI, and just putting title, abstract, if you're lucky, maybe the license. So we thought rather than going out with a stick and saying, you must, we really thought we'd pull apart the workflow. And as part of it, we interviewed 8 repositories and 8 publishers. Now, we're more advanced on summarising the publisher workflow, but I feel that from Matt's perspective as a publisher, we invited him to this session to present the work that he's done. So I'll now hand over to Matt. So I think you are the next slide. And he'll run us through what the findings are. So again, sorry, just quickly, we've had to get an extension because the interviews we got are just so rich. It's really hard to synthesize them. And this is where we're at. We've interviewed and we've just about finished the thematic analysis on the right-hand side. And Matt will give you the thematic results from the publisher. I think you're next now.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. Yeah, and just to note too that our work and this project that we're going to talk about, that Leslie's been introducing, wasn't done in isolation. There's an awful lot of people out there working on different elements of this problem about how repositories and journals and publishers, and I draw sort of like a distinction between them because there's a bit of difference journal to journal even within publishers, how they are interacting and what the pain points are, and basically how should they structure themselves to avoid that those pain points. And so there's been a work concluded by a cross sector group, the Tier 2 group, which involved academics, involved publishers, and they produced, and they came and consulted with us. We kind of see our project as coming in after their work, where they worked on creating essentially a handbook of the idealized workflow processes that a publisher should introduce in order to support reproducibility and fairness as much as possible. And the other one that we've engaged with is a Force 11 working group, looking at a similar scope to ours, but at a much, much bigger scale and without the stakeholder consultation, which has pros and cons. I mean, pros, I think, in the sense that they've been able to put forward a very interesting report that's again, like Tier 2, presenting an idealized scenario that is aspirational, that I think is quite challenging, and that I think is very interesting. But also, from a con perspective, they're missing some of the kind of detail, some of the problems that we have in these different sectors and in the publishing industry that actually stop anything happening. So, but just to sort of say that the work that we're doing does connect to wider initiatives in this area. Next slide, please. So, a bit dense on the text here. I will warn you in advance that interviews mean that the slides are a little bit text dense, but we'll do our best. So the methods. We used a slightly different method than I think any of us in this room probably are used to, making some generalizations there. I'm a geologist and a geochemist by background before I went into publishing. So not an expert in qualitative interview processes, but I have done a bit, and I've done a bit of thematic analysis prior to this project. So myself and the other one of the other co-chairs, Natalie Rea, have done work in this and have been helping with the other co-chairs and the working group as large really process the data we got. But initially we started with a more quantitative, more simple use case template, which sort of just kind of asked, from largely the perspective of repositories, what do you do? How do you do it? When do you do it? What's the stages you do it at? How long does it take? All this kind of very, very structured, very quantitative approach that probably could have got us data that we could have, measured and analyzed in that way. But when confronted with this from a publisher perspective, there's absolutely no way I could fill in a use case template like that, because none of my 16 journals work the same way. And you take that problem and you compound it across a company like Taylor and Francis, which is 2,500 journals, and you take that across the sector, and you've got a real problem of how you're actually able to capture that heterogeneity. So we switched to using semi-structured interviews. So we developed the questions collaboratively within the working group. What did we want to ask these different stakeholders, the repositories and the publishers? We then conducted the interviews. Now, the interviews were conducted solely by 3 of the 4 chairs who were trained by the University of Arizona. That was a requirement of the Institutional Review Board, because we were going to anonymize the interviews and what the interviewees said. So we couldn't open that up wider, but we do have this kind of, because we're an RDA working group, we do have to work openly as well. They were around 60 minutes each, and recorded, and then we worked with initial transcription from the software, which we then manually corrected. No AI use was permitted under the IRB. As Leslie said, we interviewed, I think it was 8 publishers, 7 repositories, maybe it was 8 repositories, I can't remember. But we tried when we selected them, and invited them, and we got pretty much everyone we invited first time, to get a mix of geographies, so not just like a US perspective. We were also looking for European perspective, Australian perspective, and further afield if we could get it. We looked at the size of these organizations with respect to publishers. We were looking at very large publishers, and I can't identify who any of them were, but we had very large publishers and we had quite small publishers. We had commercial publishers, we had non-profit and society publishers. We had a good mix in the group, and also had, from our external perspective, we knew that there were differences in workflow, so we get a lot of different perspectives. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I'll not dwell on this too much, but just to explain how we actually reach the conclusions that we're reaching, we use something called thematic analysis, and it's a way that in social science you can analyze a rich set of text, like interview data, and get kind of critical information out of it. So the workflow that we use, where we anonymize the transcripts, and then we, plus opening up to the wider working group, invited people to simply read through the transcripts and add annotations, add questions, add comments, start discussion. And we have monthly meetings. Those have now become bi-weekly, I think, or weekly meetings, where we go through and give people an opportunity to feedback the data on the data that we have. From all of that discussion, from all of those trends that we've seen, all of the themes that we see cropping up again, we generate what are called codes. And codes are simply interesting features in the data that you give a kind of specific reference to. So, for example, something that you may see coming up time and time again that you want to make a note is, there are lots of comments here about staff time cost in doing data checks. So that could be a simple code that you apply. And then you organize these codes into themes, and eventually the interview data then becomes organized into a theme structure. So rather than looking at it like question by question, how did the people, what did they say in response to this question? Because in a semi-structured interview, they're actually in some places answering 2 or 3 questions at once. The best way to do that is to look at the themes that emerge within it, and then sort that after the fact, rather than go question by question in your interpretation. So it's a well-known methodological form of analysis in social science. And so this is forming the basis of the discussion that we'll talk about today, and also leading us towards the recommendations that we're developing that will pass to the RDA at the conclusion of our project. Next slide, please. So as Leslie mentioned, we interviewed publishers, we interviewed repositories. So within the publisher data so far, there are 9 core themes that are coming out that have been really interesting. So I'm only going to talk about the ones in red in the interest of time. I think they're quite interesting, but all of these are very, very interesting for different reasons. So the first one that Leslie mentioned, just to speak to it briefly, because Leslie mentioned it, the role of the learned societies. Something that they surfaced during this this working group discussion that was, very obvious to publishing stakeholders, not something that was a surprise to us at all, but very surprising that, researchers, editors, repositories were unaware of, was the significant role learned societies that own journals, the power they retain over control of how a journal operates and how its policy is set, even when that learned society journal is partnered with a large commercial publisher or a large nonprofit publisher. And that, what Leslie was kind of saying about, not recognizing the power they had, there is a power there, because largely when it comes to data policy and data sharing policy and that kind of thing, the publishers largely defer to what the societies want. And so there is a kind of additional kind of influence here that possibly hadn't been realized from other perspectives. But again, from the publisher, and this is why it's so interesting to have these cross stakeholder groups, because things that are obvious to us are not obvious to other parts of the community. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these ones in red to kind of explain a little bit about why these pain points that exist between why it's difficult to get data from a domain repository into journals. Why is that the case? And I'll talk a little bit about these. But the consistent sort of picture here is there's a lot of heterogeneity in how things are working between different publishers, within publishers, with respect to things like data checks. And so you can sort of start to sort of glean why these friction points exist. Next slide, please. So the first that I'll speak to a little bit are repository lists. So in these slides, what I've done on the left is I've kind of pulled together the kind of conclusions, and on the right, I've tried to pull together some of the juicy quotes from the interviews that I think nicely speak to what we're talking about. One of the things that's commonly put forward and is commonly discussed, and in fact it's in the COPDESS Commitment Statement, is that publishers should point researchers towards specific repositories or towards repositories that are aligned with particular standards or particular communities or whatever. We did not find a lot of support for that on the publishers that we interviewed, but the reasons were quite interesting. So the first was that quite often this kind of information is centralized at a very high level in many of the both commercial and society publishers that we interviewed, and they found that this made it just sort of incompatible with subject or journal specific advice. So to give you an example, it's just very difficult, or for some reason publishers find it very difficult to issue advice on where to deposit earth science data as opposed to data in general. That kind of depositing data in general, a lot of those resources exist, but they're not structured, or their websites aren't structured, or their companies aren't structured in such a way that they have that kind of like subject platform that they can put that out in. I think there's work that's happening that will change that in several publishers, speaking to people over the last year or so. There's also concern that repository recommendations might be seen as endorsements. But then, on the other side, what publishers expressed was they have no capacity within their own staffing to assess whether or not those repositories would be suitable to be endorsed. So they were very, very reluctant to point people towards specific repositories for that reason. Then what came also sort of relatedly to that, difficulties in maintaining a list due to a number of factors. So unclear responsibility for where this sits within an organization. Lots of big publishers and society publishers have, for example, an open science or a data team. And then there are individual subject teams. Who owns these lists? Who's responsible for them? Who manages them with staff turnover? And before you know it, there's a very famous list that exists out there that we find that is on a society publisher's website, that we find a lot of commercial publishers directed people towards. And then we find out, over the course of our interviews, that perhaps that's not necessarily a live resource. We also found that there was new hesitation around recommending repositories because repositories might not be stable, that we might be directing people towards things that might not be there. So that kind of second quote there, the concern that things may not be as persistent as we previously thought. There was also kind of a philosophical perspective that was quite interesting, which a few publishers expressed, which was that they did not believe as publishers that they should be sort of determining where data is best deposited, that should be coming from the scientific community. And while they would probably take their initial recommendations from editors or from board members or from the community in some form, eventually that link might be lost. And so it would not be the community leading it. It would be publishers, and they were kind of reluctant to do that. And also there was a concern about redundancy, about just replicating what's been done before by organizations like RE3 Data. And I think what we're coming to in this portion of the work in terms of like a recommendation is what's in that last quotation there in the yellow box, which is, I think it would be much better if there was a publisher independent list of standard repositories. And this interview is conducted in the context of Earth, our working groups in the context of Earth Science. So take that there as a list of Earth Science repositories. Next slide, please. So the other thing is, when it comes to checking data and checking how data is being, correctly referenced in data availability statements, checking that links work, checking that those links are in the kind of right repositories that align with whatever the journal's data policy is. We find that there's quite a lot of pressure, time pressure and staff pressure around conducting those checks because they compound per paper that are coming through the publisher. So conservative estimates that we got through our interviews were anywhere from sort of like 10 to 25 minutes per paper. But variable depending on initial compliance. So one of the, not a quote here, but one of the publishers, I think it was Publisher F, one of the people interviewed said, this can be very quick if they've got everything right. But basically, they don't often do that. And we have to go back and we have to go through and we have to figure out what's wrong and we have to talk to them and there have to be emails backwards and forwards and it takes a long time. And you can kind of see a little bit about the time pressure that some of the publishers are talking about. So you have a smaller publisher here saying, we publish about 5,000 articles a year. If to do this, we need to add 2 full-time staff members, and not all publishers are large. So this is actually quite significant. The second quote says something very similar. So when we brought this in, it took an extra 10 to 15 minutes per paper at revision to do this. It's the equivalent of adding 2 full-time staff, which we only have a staff of 25 to 30. That's a 10%, 5-10% headcount, which could be quite significant for them, maybe not something that they can afford to do. And bearing in mind, they may not have introduced that uniformly in all their journals at once. So what we found from our interviews about workflows and about, asking when in the publishing process publishers are checking that data from repositories, be that generalist or domain, where that's being checked. They fall into 2 camps. And I mean, it's being checked, but being hard enforced, like a very hard enforcement of the journal data policy. there are two kind of buckets that the publishers fall into. There are those who check it at submission and those that check it at acceptance. Most publishers, even the ones that are doing it at acceptance, they are doing checks at submission, but they're not hard. They will allow the manuscript to proceed and basically say, you've got to get your data in here, or you've got to get your data in the right repository or whatever by the point of acceptance. So they are allowing the paper to progress. But that first group at submission, they are pushing the paper back hard. They are, if you're not complying with the policy, your paper is being returned to you until it does, and not being allowed to progress to editorial assessment and peer review. And they have very different reasons as to why they're doing it. And it depends on basically where they see their biggest pain points. So that at submission group, they argue that this approach saves their editors and their reviewers time on peer reviewing something that might not be accepted because the authors never comply with the data sharing policy. So they see that as sort of saying, the real pressure, which is a very true point, a real pressure within the publication process right now is that there's a lot of difficulty with securing reviewers. It's a lot of reviewer fatigue. We are going to prioritize protecting reviewer time and not sending stuff out to review that isn't going to be compliant with the journal at all. But the acceptance group, they are thinking about it differently, and this kind of links to the kind of staffing pressure that we just talked about. They're saying, well, we're not going to spend time having staff check papers for data compliance that might not pass peer review. So both groups are kind of right, but it just depends on to them which group of their kind of stakeholders in their process they feel need the most protection and need their time most protected. For sure, we saw a bit of a link between larger publishers possibly seeming more able to absorb the costs of more staff, or possibly being able to use outsourced companies to provide some of the basic administrative checks, which reduces a bit of the staff pressure, time pressure as well. But I would say that's not a very, very strong link within the data. I think we saw variability here between large and small publishers. I think the biggest thing was how sort of public those publishers are about promoting that they are that they support open and fair as much as possible. And that we found, that a lot of the basic checks, at least from what the publishers told us, are being done by publishers themselves, either with in-house editors who are employees of the publisher or by third-party vendors. Academic editors, they are not generally being involved in, routine, basic, what are called sort of data hygiene checks, checking that, the data availability statement is there, checking that, the link resolves. They're not doing that. They might get more complex queries after that, but they're not doing those basic checks. That's not desirable or realistic. The next slide, please. And then researcher behavior. I think this was quite interesting because there's some similarities that are emerging with the repositories and some differences here about how what publishers see. And I think publishers see a very broad, very global spectrum of awareness about data sharing practices. And generally speaking, most of the publishers that we interviewed said that researchers display a lack of understanding around data sharing practices, and that they think there's insufficient education or awareness about it. They also don't consider themselves to be the right group to address these education gaps. Now, that was quite an interesting conclusion that came out because a lot of them put a lot of work into, and they talked a bit about this, doing outreach, having resources on their websites, having stuff in their information for authors on each journal page. but they generally considered themselves too late in the process. Like if you haven't thought about depositing your data at the point at which you're submitting your paper, it's too late. By the time you're reading a journal webpage, it's too late. That was the perspective that they were kind of sharing through the process. And they felt people that be upstream or earlier in the research cycle, like for example, funders or something like that, would be or institutions would be a place where people should be getting that education and awareness of how to share data. Some, though, expressed that actually, in their view, it was not really that there were so many technical issues with the workflows between publishers and repositories, but that the main thing that they were encountering was researcher apathy. So a lack of buy-in, a lack of motivation, or another way to think about that would be a lack of incentivization. So for sure, I think a lot of, in the US and Europe, we have, and in the UK where I am, we have, funder mandates to share our data in particular ways, but that is not the case in large portions of the world and for a large majority of the world. And those researchers kind of, they're like, why should I do this? I have no time. I have no time to figure this out. And that is a common thing that they reported that they encountered thinking about this globally. They also, interestingly, though, was this kind of thing that's been voiced before at COPDESS. I've heard it at editor roundtables before. I've heard it at publisher roundtables before, that the publishers are scared that if they introduce stricter data sharing requirements, that they're basically going to end up scaring large portions of the research community away, places that are not used to dealing with these kinds of mandates. But lots of publishers reported that introducing stricter data requirements didn't alter their submission pipelines, which was quite an interesting result. And others, on the other hand, did repeat this common fear that there is a competitive environment, that they're worried that if they make the barrier on their journals too high, that portion of researchers will just sort of give up and go to a journal that hasn't made it so complex to submit or so difficult to submit. Another common concern that we've heard from the repository group is that that particularly researchers fear that the publisher will not publish a paper if the repository, particularly the domain repository, doesn't manage to meet the tight publishing deadline. Usually this is happening at the pain point where a sort of provisional accept decision has been made, or it's, you need to deposit and meet the data requirements of the journal before we will finally accept the paper. This kind of a sort of statement, which is completely reasonable and in line with the journal policy, but usually comes with quite a tight publishing deadline, of days or weeks. Publishers said this highly unlikely, honestly, at this point, that given the editorial work, the reviews, the editor's work, the fact that at this point now they have a paper they have in their pipeline, that they have in their numbers, that they really want to see published, it's highly unlikely that they're going to let it go. But at the same time, they find that if they do not give deadlines, authors just don't get the tasks done. So there's kind of maybe some discussion point there about, what's a reasonable deadline for some of this, and maybe sort of reassuring authors that it's not necessarily going to be that publishers going to throw out a very good paper that's crossed a high editorial threshold and had a lot of editorial work put into it because you're, a few days short in getting your repository link through. Next slide.
Matt,
can
I ask you to speed it up a bit?
Speed up, yeah. I'm almost done.
Okay,
so
thanks.
I'll speed up through this one. So organizational priorities and structures. This is not really going to surprise anyone. The core priority of all publishers, large, small, commercial, society, nonprofit, is to move manuscripts through the publishing system as quickly as possible. So any process that slowed down the manuscript journey, triggered this fear that people would walk with their feet. And this kind of links to a lot of the concerns about waiting for domain-specific repositories, where some of the turnaround times have become what some of the publishers express as too long to be compatible with their publication workflows. And we have a couple of quotes there of basically them saying that they've tried to get a paper through a domain-specific repository. It's taking so long that they've ended up saying to authors, just go to the generalist repository and put your data there so we can move on and get this published. Okay, next slide, please. And then, yeah, so this is quite interesting. So basically what their view was on other stakeholders. So funders, institutions, as I mentioned, they see those as very, very important in actually being able to change researcher behavior, particularly funders. That came up in a number of interviews. They're like, with the open access mandates that publishers had to adapt to before, they said that was because they had to comply with funder mandates. Everyone had to adapt and change the whole publishing system, and perhaps they should do something similar and provide sort of incentivization structures to get people to do that. And just basically that intervention needed to be earlier in the research cycle. Publishers recognized that there was more they could do and a need for cross-stakeholder collaboration, that no one was going to solve this on their own. And yes, they were pointing towards funders and institutions, but several of them said, look, there's a lot as publishers we could do. There's a lot more we could do in standardization. There's a lot more we could do to make this easy for authors, for sure. And we have to work more closely with repositories. But several of them said, I don't know how to do that. I don't know where to work with repositories. What forum could I go to? And I would tentatively suggest that COPDESS is exactly the kind of place in neurosciences that they should be coming to. Next slide. So very quickly then, this was the kind of publisher workflow that we started with a kind of basic overview of. You start with a manuscript, it goes through quality checks, goes through review, and out pops at the other side. This is extremely possibly oversimplistic. It's a very nice idealized version of what happens, but it's quite oversimplistic as what actually happens and where all of the pain points go. So if you pop to the next slide, Leslie.
Next slide.
Oh, next slide, please. Sorry, I forgot he was driving there. So this is a very busy slide and very hard, I imagine, to see in the room, but don't worry about it. The key point is we're starting to tease out, where these pain points are with specific publisher workflows, why certain publishers and repository pain points exist in certain workflows and not in others. What would be the recommendations that we would do, and that's kind of linking basically where the data is in the data journey, where the manuscript is in the manuscript journey, and where the time pressures are from each stakeholder's perspective. What's least time critical, what's most time critical, and yeah, basically the numbers here relate to the different themes that we've, the lightning bolts are all of the pain points where they exist in the different workflow processes, and they link specifically to the themes that we've identified in our report. So I think I'll stop there in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive and insightful. I would at this point stop for a moment and actually hear from you, your reactions. As far as I heard, you're all representing repositories in one way or the other. And what's your reaction? I mean, what have been your experiences with coordinating with journals? Have you ever interacted? Has this been an experience that you had as well from the other side? I mean, I can relate to a lot of these things from the repository side.
Sure. This is Dean Carter again from NOAA, and my colleague here, Paul, and I, a lot of what we do is we mint data DOIs for researchers that are publishing. And it is very interesting to see this presentation from the publisher side of things, because we definitely have our views and opinions on the repository, domain repository side of things. So in NOAA, NOAA has allowed NOAA researchers, the ideal is that they will submit to NOAA the official repository of NOAA, which is NCI, which where we work, and they would get the data DOI. But we also see, and we have a process to reserve DOI process so that if they're under a tight timeline for publishing, we can provide that reserve DOI if there's certain criteria is met that we have custody of the data, that it is within scope of our collecting policy, and we have archival control of it. And we will meant to reserve DOI, but oftentimes that message in NOAA, we have a hard time communicating it, that we can do that for them. They often rush to the alternate data repositories, which standards are a bit lax, maybe metadata standards and things like that. So that's something that we struggle with. So it's this is a very interesting from my perspective.
Do the submissions that you get happen also like when the manuscript is submitted, or do you get submissions that it's like it's that same situation? Yeah, I'm always wondering if there are actually communities where funding agencies insist on getting the data at the end of the project and not at the end of writing your manuscript, right? Because that would be, there's some communities I know in the ocean sciences when you have ship operations or NASA missions, it's the end of the mission, something that sets the date, and that would make it, a lot more.
Terry Velikat again. I'm again with ORNL and data manager on 3 long-term projects. And so they all act differently, which is not a surprise. But all of our data is, 2 of the projects have from early on highlighted data as being archived. But it's been a cultural change over 10 years. And it's still a process. But on one of my projects, 2 of them, the researchers are really good. It's just a thing that's evolved, and this is what you do. When you start getting your paper together, then you are organizing your data. And a lot of them have realized that when you're organizing your paper and you're organizing your data, it helps a lot. And especially you get feedback from the data curators, which helps them a lot with their writing and the methods and getting everything organized, which is, again, it's a cultural shift. I don't think this is being told to anybody in the university still. It's something like we get a new postdoc and you get them trained and then they move on. And so then you get another one and it's ongoing, but we have the requirement to, within these projects, 2 of the projects, even before the OSTP memo came down, of sharing early and often within the project, and then the expectation of all the data that goes along with the publication to be published. And now we've got embedded in our data management plans that all data has to be published, regardless of whether it comes out with a publication. Now, whether or not that's all happening, it's one of those, judges, but I've had pushback from over the years from publishers going, well, we're not, because they're required to put the full citation in the reference section, not just mention it in the acknowledgments or the data availability statement. And there's been pushback over time. And I will tell them, tell them that your project says that you have to do this. And if they still say no, give me their name and I'll tell Shelley Stahl, because she was trying to track publishers and educate them on using the data set citations.
I mean, if there's one thing to learn, it's what a complex landscape that is, you know. I mean, these studies have, I mean, we were somehow, I think, or I at least was somehow naive when we started COPDESS. It's like, yeah, we get everybody together and then we come out with some consistent rules. And it just shows the dimensions that we're working in. And, you know, just what Matt showed here was, you know, the more domain specific journals versus the big ones, the smaller ones. It's just, it's very hard to establish one way to get it all done, and different domains that publish, you know, data in a more comprehensive way versus, you know, where I work in geochemistry, people select, you know, some data from a bigger data set that goes into the publication. So there's always the difference between the actual project data set and what gets published. So it's very complex. So,
okay. I think we need to move on in the interest of time, because we've only got half an hour. We've got to hear about the editors and the publishers and the researchers.
I don't think I'm going to go very deep into this. So it's maybe just a triggering some thoughts for all of you that this editors roundtable that I started talking about was an effort within a specific domain. It was geochemistry, where, you know, in 2007, sharing of data was still not a great, not at a great shape in our status. And it was a step, basically talking to the publishers and editors to say, what can we do to really make data sharing better, make the documentation of the data in publications better, and so on. And so this has continued based on these drivers and the approach to stay in touch. And we do these meetings of the editors roundtable for the last 5 years. Again, after it was all moved to COPDESS, we realized, you know, talking with the publishers very specifically about the data type that we're dealing with has a lot of advantages and drives us further forward than just talking very, it's not completely generic, it's earth sciences, but still, that's a much wider range of data, and there are very specific aspects to certain types of data. So we have, I'm not going to go into all this, what our first sets of recommendations were and so on. We realized then, and this was the moment in 2011, we're not there yet, majority of data still in tables, not going into repositories, that we needed to revive the editors roundtable. And so now we're meeting again, and it just slightly more than a week ago that the Goldschmidt conference, which is the big geochemistry annual meeting, happened, and we had our editors roundtable, and we again talked about the workflows, the policies at different journals. And this is just kind of showing how, you know, how much we are in alignment with what Matt reported. We had editors from Nature there, and we had editors from the Journal of Petrology there, and how different it was. You know, Nature said, we are affiliated with Figshare, everything, you know, that's the only recommendation we do. They have a lot of staff to help with the review process. So a lot of what Matt reported on, versus the Journal of Petrology being very specific in their publishing of petrological geochemical data, who recommend or basically insist on the data going to one specific repository where a very solid review of the data is done. So that's, you know, just a confirmation of all of what Matt had said before. what we're trying to do as repositories now, we have a few years, and now it's probably 8 years already ago, the geochemical data repositories formed an international initiative called One Geochemistry that's trying to establish better standards for geochemical data. And we're now working jointly on establishing recommended metadata sets for different analytical protocols. And we talked here at this editors roundtable with the publishers. Would you endorse that? If there is community agreed upon protocols, how to document what the provenance of the data is, would you adopt that? Would you use that to ensure your journal aligns, with the quality expectations of the community? The outcome was not quite conclusive, I would say. Some were very much in favor, like the Journal of Petrology, and others were very careful not to commit to anything. The other thing was really a discussion also about this timeline that Matt just presented about. So I'm not going to go further into that. Leslie, perspectives from researchers.
Okay, so how about we run through mine and then we can connect. So this project called GeoFair was set up and it's funded by NSF. And we were actually doing, again, what Matt said, that, the publishers are clearly saying, why don't we do something to help organise the researchers and make them aware of what's there. And I think someone else mentioned that about, researchers just don't understand it. So taking it from a different perspective, this project was spun off. Next slide, please. And, of course, because they're taking it's pretty similar to the diagram or the concepts Matt had. We're looking at the funders, the mandates, the repositories and the journals. So we're kind of bringing into the workflow now the perspectives of the national mandates and the funders, because next slide, please. Yeah, it's all misaligned and it's not working. So next. And so the data sharing landscape from the researcher perspective is researchers have, low variable data management skills, disparate community missing guidance, and it's very difficult for researchers to navigate, just as we saw it was difficult to navigate that publisher workflow. Next. And looking at this survey, researchers are increasingly feeling that it does increase citation of their research papers, but again, they're paying attention to it down here because, that's where it hurts most. They've got to get their data published, and now the publishers are asking for it. It's a lot harder. Next. And yet what we do know is from this review by AGU, and picking up on what one of the Noah said, it's just a fact, 80% of data sets that go with AGU publications are in Zenodo with insufficient metadata to enhance their research or to be fair. Next. And so what we're doing they're doing in this project across ocean, seismology and hydrology, so just taking 3 disciplines and leveraging societies, sectors at AGU, EGU, GPU, and getting direct, just as Matt did with the publishers, we're getting into trying to understand this workflow from the researcher's perspective. The oceans one is the most advanced. Next. And so what was coming out is that we need a framework with data sharing practices that are easy for the researchers to get and develop these web-based resources to help researchers discover and access resources and enable the communities. So that's why we're working through the communities, seismology, seismology, hydrology, and oceans. Next. These are the three key players in this project. Next. And so this is the project timeline because we finish 27 is we've engaged the oceans and we're starting to engage the seismology, and the practices between the two communities are similar, but there are differences. And so, again, you can't develop a generic resource for all researchers of any domain. Next. And so the outputs, the key one we're trying to do, number 2, is the web-based resource of trusted community content, but more importantly, engage discipline leadership and researchers to support this. And they're also, because let's face it, a lot of the editors are still practicing scientists, trying to work with editors, in particular, editors-in-chief. Next. I think we'll skip that. We all know that that's the dev pipeline. But this is just a prototype of what they're starting to get going in the oceans community in consultation with the researchers, societies where they engage, but kind of working through those section leadership. I mean, you've got to start somewhere, but the leadership at AGU, EGU and JPGU, it's not going to cover everything, but as I said, we're trying to explore this thing that Matt's saying the publishers are asking for. We're not getting the skills. So when the researchers go out to work for some of the agencies, they don't have the skills. And so this is the resources we're developing, or they're trying to develop in this project. Next. Okay, so I think, as I said, this is what's going on next in the interest of time. Okay, so Kirsten and Bobby, I'll hand over to you now, unless there's any quick questions for
I would
Kirsten and myself.
Any reaction? Had you heard about the GeoFair project before? No, it's something new at least. Would that be something that in your communities would help from your perspective as a repository? I mean, I assume your atmospheric ocean sciences are and yeah, I'm with, from the perspective of my repository, I found that it's really difficult to define the granularity of communities, right? I mean, seismology may be fairly homogeneous with respect to their data types, but in geochemistry, we have so many different data types. And so we started actually within the repository to define communities with different sample types or different analytical methods where, you have so many different analytical methods that have very different metadata requirements. So, it's a challenge then to say what's the overarching set of best practices versus making it work for every piece of your repository. That's just something I wanted to add. So, I mean, for the last 10, 15 minutes, whatever time we want to take, this is coming back to the beginning of sort of the today COPDESS was the enabling fair project that AGU was running that led to this commitment statement. And if you go online to the COPDESS website and the COPDESS.org, you can get to this commitment statement. It was way too long, to put everything up. This was the overarching goal, is really, ensure that Earth, space, and environmental science research outputs are well curated in trusted repositories and linked to other information. It's sort of, the goals of all of what we're doing in the repositories. And so in this commitment statement, it lists what repositories promise to do, and then it lists what the publishers promised to do, and that was pretty long. Those were 2 slides of items. And it also had, invited societies, communities, institutions, funders, and so on, to commit to specific items. So it's a long list, and it was signed by many institutions at the time. But, it was the beginning of FAIR. We've learned for 10 years now, I think over the last 10 years, quite a bit of what can be implemented. We have done a lot of modifications. We're now talking about AI-ready data, about, decision-ready data. There's a whole new world. And so the question that we wanted to put out there, is it time for us to actually do a revision, do a review and potential revisions to this commitment statement? Is that still something that we should have? Do we need to rethink what COPTESS is doing, how it's doing it, how do we drive progress? And Leslie, Matthew, whoever else is on, there are 4 people. I don't know who else is on. Oh, you're one of them. Okay, so Leslie, if you want to say anything, and then, we should get your input.
Right now, I am just being cautious, and I feel that these side projects which COPTESS members are attached to is coming out with some, not surprising issues. Like, for example, we've never ever considered or realised how significant the role of the learned societies is in all this. And I guess what I wanted to say is Matt has presented on the interviews with the publishers. Natalie Raya and Danny are at the moment just starting to collate what the repositories are saying. And as I said, we've got GeoFair exploring researchers. I think maybe we wait another 6 months and see what comes in across the broader spectrum. But my feeling is that we could actually revisit this statement and bring it up to date. And in particular, I think we need to put the considerations of AI and emphasise. I think we did think about it a little bit when we wrote this in 2018, but it's the cultural change, which, again, one of the speakers talked about earlier. It's just so significant. And where do you implement it? Because, I know the major agencies are really getting on. I was staggered yesterday. You're getting onto it. One agency was listing all the data stewardship positions they have. I hadn't even heard of half of them. I wouldn't know an organisation in Australia that has them. And so it's kind of starting to get that up through the help of the funders into the repositories. But then the sticking point to me is the domain repositories, which is the focus of a session this time tomorrow, are just such under threat because you're coming at it, we need more money. And where are you going to get it from? I'll hand over to Matt.
Yeah, I think it's, I would probably agree with Leslie. I mean, I think that we are finding a lot in Repo2Pub that I think will provide concrete, guidance to COPTESS about if it does want to change elements of this commitment statement about what's more feasible. But I think kind of the issue I would raise not so much related to it is related to the commitment statement, is that, I don't know that COPDESS has that many publishers engaged right now.
Right.
That's kind of the feel I get. I know when we meet in person, we tend to get a few more, but I know my counterparts on the conference floor and they're not in that meeting room. And I think that there's sort of within publishers, you do have this incredible siloing that happens between people who are, and this quite often happens in people at publishers that come to COPDESS. They're open science, they're data people within the publisher, so they are already aligned with a lot of this in principle and concept. They're very happy to go along with it. But perhaps people that are actually working with the journals, working with the editors, working with the societies that are publishing with that publisher, they're not in the room. And I think TNF is in an unusual position with COPDESS because our now head of open science was once the Earth Science publisher who engaged with this like back in 2017, 2018, something like that. And that's kept us aligned, but that's drifted. So I think, and in terms of actually, there's things here in the statement like trying to phase out the use of supplements and stuff like that. Like there's a lot of actual actionable stuff that I think that will require us to bring more publishers in to actually discuss the feasibility of some of the commitment statements and recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, we've had in past ESIP sessions, we've had this discussion that, is an ESIP cluster really the right solution for COPDESS to do what it needs to do? And so, that's a question I think that still needs to be addressed and discussed more, especially I think once we have the full outcomes of the project that Matt reported on, that we really can build on a different foundation, on much more comprehensive perspectives. How do we move forward to have more publishers in the room, and not just for this 1 hour breakfast or lunch meeting at AGU or whatever, but the challenge being that obviously all these are voluntary activities that run besides our normal jobs. And so, really getting a lot organized and underway is a challenge, remains a challenge. And we have, for example, we run now monthly meetings of COPDESS online. We need to have 2 meetings, one for the Western Hemisphere, one for the Eastern Hemisphere, because we have Australia online, we have Europe online. So it's a commitment, and it's 7 a.m. in the morning, the meeting. And so I would love to hear from you, because you've all been new in this cluster, in the meeting. Is this something you would stay engaged with? Have you gotten enough out of it to stay interested in what COPDESS is doing? And do you have ideas how we could potentially, come to a more inclusive structure for engaging publishers?
Hey, this is Paul with NOAA and CEI. Just want to say thank you for presenting this today. It's very interesting. And I think this is very important work. And thank you for doing it. I think you guys are starting to drive change, whether you know it or not. One of your slides about the repository commitments, I was reading through it and realized that many of the bullets there are things that NOAA has only just recently started to implement. And I think you guys were probably ahead of us on this. So whether you realize it or not, I think you're already driving some institutional change, even at the federal level. So, yeah, this is really important work. So just thank you for doing it. And I'd be interested in trying to get more involved. Of course, we have limited time, limited resources at the unfortunately at the federal level, but absolutely, I think this is definitely relevant to our work, and we'd be delighted to get involved.
So you hadn't heard about this before? No.
Oh, this is new to us.
So I wonder that if we're also not doing the best job in getting the message out. And I mean, that is obviously a great advantage with ESIP, but ESIP being very US focused, right? So we
So I want to also say something too really quick. I wonder if this is a community-esque thing, as somebody who works with under NCEI and in the NOAA pillar. I think a lot of this work has been done in tandem with AGU, which I think is, a very large entity in the geosciences community in America. But we have AMS, which I know draws a lot of at least the meteorological community away from AGU, right? In at least the building that I work in, right? There are probably maybe 10 people out of hundreds that attend AGU any given year, but you'll see 90% of our building at AMS. So I'm wondering if this is where some of the knowledge gap is coming in, where you're focusing on the larger entities, which is great, but a lot of I go back to the trickle down effect. I brought it up in another thing. I wonder if just some of the efforts here need to be diverted to the more niche communities, because I was similar to them. Yeah. I'm a fellow with the COPDESS group. I had never heard of COPDESS. Yeah. But I had never heard of COPDESS until now.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. I have one foot in the planetary sciences and have started to talk to publishers there saying, do you know about, do you have data policies? Do you know about COPDESS? And nobody had. So I think you're right at the point of, we need a better network in some way. I think this current structure is driven by the fact that we are all in the earth sciences, but a fairly limited range of activities, and none of us goes to AMS and or other of those meetings. So yeah, there's a different marketing strategy or engagement strategy needs to be there. And I mean, in that respect, I was really happy to hear, we have NCI here, we have RNL here. We're casting the net a little wider than we used to. And maybe that triggers even more, outreach to other communities. So this is a good development. And, I would encourage you to sign up for the mailing list. And I don't know, is the mailing list on the COPDESS website? I think so, right? Yeah. So because then, we continue to stay in touch and engaged. And if there are others within NCI, I'm learning in how many repositories there are at NOAA. It would be good to get, and I will do my share with the NASA side also to get them engaged. Yeah. Any further comments? Leslie, Matt? I don't know who number 4 is. Maybe it's this computer.
Yeah. I guess my only comments is, I guess my only comment to those of you that are in the audience is at this time tomorrow, there's a presentation on the data sustainability management cluster and work going on in sustainability of repositories. And I'm also associated with that cluster, and I get depressed because I see this COPDESS one is needing more resources. And yet when you go and look at what's happening to the repositories, it's a bit dismal. So we hope that someone, feed in what we're coming from this, because there's a catch-22 with the repositories, is that if we can't get the data sets from the repositories recognised in those repositories through being able to track papers, et cetera, and if the researchers go and stick the stuff continually, as we said, 80% into Zenodo, then you're effectively saying, well, Zenodo will do, it's paid for by France. We do not need these domain repositories. And so I think there's a critical, stark reality hitting us that we need the repositories to start caring about this and working with the publishers, because that way we can track, reuse, and justify our existence and improve our science. That's my final words. And thank you all for coming. Kirsten, Matt, have you anything you want to say?
No, I mean, thank you all for coming. Thank you for the engagement. I think it was very useful. Just to reiterate, I think there's an appetite within publishers to help. And I don't know, to what extent that's financial, but certainly in terms of getting more involved in this, it's just a case of bringing the right network in. And I think also giving them something to get their teeth into, month on month, year on year, rather than, just sort of generic. But yeah.
What I see is, as a contribution could be just to help the sustainability of COPDESS, in having maybe, a bit more of Bobby's time, or, there's something that actually helps us be more organized and move forward. But yeah, thanks everybody. And, hopefully we have you online at the next COPDESS monthly meeting. And it's actually for you, probably it's 5:00 on the East Coast. So probably, I assume you're somewhere in Colorado. Oh, yeah, that would work. Probably not the 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. Okay, great. Thank you.